The information provided by Trading Forex Price Action to you does not constitute personal financial advice. The information provided is of a general nature only and does not take into account your individual objectives, financial situation, or needs. It should not be used, relied upon, or treated as a substitute for specific professional advice.
Weekly Forecast.
Hey guys, this is a weekly forecast for December 13th through the 17th of 2021. Alright, we'll start off with the dollar yen. This is a monthly chart. We'll start off with an overview. So although I was expecting price to pull back to this 109 area and then down, right back down to this pivot low right here, as I mentioned in previous forecasts, if monthly price closes past this pivot high right here, in which it did at this point right here, the short bias to this pivot low is no longer valid, and so in the long term, I am neutral biased. And moreover, on the weekly chart, since there was a weekly short trade that formed here, I'm currently waiting for another long trade to form so I can make my short-term bias. In the short term, I'm also neutral biased. Okay, let's talk entries. Okay, this is the weekly chart. Let me run you by the setup I've been looking at for the past couple of months. So there was a strong long trade that formed right here with the stop loss at this pivot low right here. And so if you recall, I took a long entry right up to these 109 areas right here. However, I took out the entire position due to the possibility that this weekly long trade possibly hit its target at a monthly strong trend line that runs right through these levels. However, as price pulled back, I was also mentioning the lower time frames are still showing long strength, and thus we got a slight move up again and came right back down to these levels. Now at this point right here on the daily chart, there was a strong daily long trade that formed with a stop loss at this pivot low right here. And so I took another long entry. However, I took out 90% of this position roughly at these levels right here due to the possibility that in fact this last weekly long trade's target was hit at this trendline level right here. However, soon after, there was a common price action setup in which there were many weak short trades consecutively, while there were many strong long trades on the other end, which is a common price action setup that shows short-term long strength. And so I kept 10% of that position in all the way up to these levels right here. And at this point, there was a weekly short trade that formed right here. And so at this point, I took out the remainder of that last daily long trade's long position. And then soon after, there was a week long trade that formed right here. And so the bias was short, or in other words, price was likely to reach this pivot low right here before reaching this pivot high. And then moreover, another week long trade formed. So again, the bias remained short, but now the bias was stating that price is likely to reach this pivot low right here before reaching this pivot high. And so if you recall, as price pulled back in these levels, I took a short entry with the stop loss at this pivot high right here and its main target being right down here. However, then price ranged for the next couple of months, especially due to the month of August when trading liquidity is low. And as price ranged for a period of 2 months, there are actually two long trend lines that formed right at these levels right here. And so I was mentioning this could possibly be a target for this last weekly short entry. And moreover, as price pulled back to these levels right here, there were lower time frame confirmation that in fact this weekly short trade did hit its target at this level. And so I aborted that entire short trade. Now if you recall, I was mentioning after there was a short trade and then price ranges about for a couple of months and new strong elements that show strong long strength form and become a target for that short trade, that shows an incredible amount of future long strength. And so although the bias at this point was long, or in other words, price is likely to reach this pivot high before reaching this pivot low, after it hit its main target at this level right here, price still showed a lot of long strength, bringing price up to these levels up here. And now at this point this week, there was actually a new short trade that formed right here. And so at this point, what I'll be looking for is for another weekly long trade to form, so I could gauge the strength of this long strength against this short strength right here, and then decide on a short-term bias. And so in other words, if this long trade is stronger than this previous short trade right here, then the bias will be long. Or in other words, price is likely to reach this pivot high right here before reaching the hypothetical long trade's pivot low. Alright, and moreover, there's some price levels I'm looking at the monthly chart for the time being. So let me just go ahead and show you those. Okay, so on this monthly chart, let me just show you the gap levels first. So the first gap we're looking at is this small gap right here. Now the price levels for those are as follows. So the upper level is at 114.47 and the lower level is at 114.28. And then moreover, there's a medium gap level that price respected this week. Let me just show you the levels for those. So the upper level will be 112.65 and the lower level will be 112.12. Alright, so those are the gap levels we should be looking for. Alright, so for the time being, price seems to be stuck between these two gap levels. Now moreover, two trend lines I will be watching for is one trend line from this pivot to this pivot right here, and another one from this pivot to this pivot right here. And you can see they're all legitimate trend lines. Now if you don't understand what I'm talking about in terms of medium and small gaps and legitimate trend lines, please watch my price action trading course, for that course is designed to provide you the necessary information so you can understand these forecasts. Okay, and last but not least, I'm sure will come into play sometime in the future, is this level right here. Now as I mentioned in the overview, the reason why I was expecting price to reach this pivot low here after a pullback to 109 was simply due to the fact that these type of huge dojis on the higher time frames, when they form typically, it is very common for price to just range about at these levels right here, respecting the outer boundaries of these dojis. Now, although price did break out of that range at this level right here, I'm quite sure that if price gets right back down to these levels right here, that is a key area to watch for any possible long trades. Okay, so let me just sum this up for you. Let's go back to the weekly chart. Okay, again on this weekly chart, so the last weekly short trade that formed was right here. And so at this point, I'll be waiting for another weekly long trade to form so I can measure this long strength against the previous weekly short trade's short strength. And if there's more short strength than long strength, then I'll be short biased. Or in other words, price is likely to reach this pivot low right here before reaching this pivot high. And I'll be waiting for a pullback as much as possible so I could take a short entry with this pivot low as the main target. Okay. Alright, so let's go on to the NZD USD pair. Okay, this is a weekly chart. We'll start off with an overview. So since this move up right here, starting from this range right here, was solely based on momentum, in the long term I'm short biased right back down to this pivot low right here. And moreover, since there was a weekly short trade that formed right here, and so currently I'm waiting for a weekly long trade to form so I can measure the strength of this long trade against this last weekly short trade to get a short-term bias. So in the short term, I'm neutral biased. Okay, let's talk entries. Okay, this is a weekly chart. Let me run you by the setup I've been looking at for the past couple of months. So there was a weak short trade that formed right here, then a strong long trade formed. And so at this point, the bias was long, or in other words, price was likely to reach this pivot high right here before reaching this pivot low. And so as price came up, I was looking for long entries on the lower time frames. However, at this point right here, another weak short trade formed. And so at this point, the bias was still long. However, the bias was now stating that price is likely to reach this pivot high right here before reaching this pivot low. And then the following week, that main target was hit right here. And since the main target was hit at this point, price just hovered right back down to where the last weekly long trade was. Okay, and then soon after, we got a slight pullback and price came right back down to these levels. Now, if you recall, at this point right here, there was a strong daily long trade that formed. However, as price came up to these levels, I was mentioning price possibly hit a target at this level right here. And so as price pulled back, I was not willing to take any long entries on the lower time frames. And then moreover, roughly at these price levels right here, all the long elements that were used for the strong daily long trade were broken out, and thus confirming that this daily long trade did hit its target at this price level right here. And so I was looking for a short entry, and there was one that formed on the daily chart roughly at these areas. However, this daily short trade also hit its target at a monthly gap level that runs right through these levels right here. And so if you recall, I was watching the lower time frames for confirmation of whether or not this target was hit. And that lower confirmation that stated that in fact the target was hit did form, so I did not take this short entry. Okay, if you don't understand how to confirm biases on the lower time frames, please watch the lesson on how to confirm trends with the lower time frames. Okay, so at this point, that daily bias that I was watching was no longer valid. Okay, so right after that, since there was no more bias, prices randomly pulled back to these areas. And then a couple of weeks back, there was actually a weekly short trade that formed right here. And so at this point, I'm waiting for another long trade to form. And again, if this long trade is stronger than this last weekly short trade, then I'll be long biased, or in other words, price is likely to reach this pivot high right here before reaching the hypothetical long trade's pivot low. Alright, so let me go ahead and show you the price levels on the higher time frames that I'm keeping an eye out for. So let's go over to the monthly chart. Okay, so on this monthly chart, at a basic level, the major levels that we're dealing with right now are gaps. So the first gap is this medium-sized gap right here. So the levels for that on the higher end is 0.6920, and the lower end would be 0.6819. And moreover, there's another gap at this level right here. And the levels for that is on the higher level, 67.86, and the lower level is 67.28. Okay, so on this higher time frame for the time being, there is a possibility that price can make that weekly long trade I was referring to earlier at this lower gap level that we're currently testing. Alright, so let me just go ahead and explain to you that daily setup I was talking about that happened about 2 months ago, because it is quite unique. So let's go over to the daily chart. Okay, so on this daily chart, like I referred to earlier, that strong daily long trade formed right here with the stop loss at this pivot low right here. Now, as price came up to these levels, there was a possibility that this daily long trade hit its target at strong monthly levels in these areas. But now, if that were the case, which in fact this target was hit, the daily bias will be short, or in other words, price is likely to reach this pivot low right here before reaching this pivot high. However, in this case, that confirmation that in fact this bias was short only came after price fell down to these levels, and I believe that confirmation formed in this area. Now at this point, I was not willing to take any short entries, for the stop loss is extremely big compared to the target. However, soon after, another daily short trade formed right here. So at this point, the bias was again short, or in other words, price was likely to reach this pivot low right here before reaching this pivot high. However, again, there was a possibility that this weekly short trade hit a target at a monthly gap level right here also. And so I was watching the lower time frames for confirmation, and there was confirmation that this target was hit on the lower time frames. And so as price pulled back, I did not take this short entry. Now, one thing I want to explain, it really depends on the pair, but especially the NZD USD, the Aussie NZD, and even the Aussie USD tend to have extremely erratic price action when it comes to these biases. Now, this is just a tendency of those pairs, where there are moments in time where the confirmation of a bias does not set up until it's too late, like in this case right here, or the lower time frame confirmation does not complement the higher time frame's bias. So in other words, there's times when you can't trade those biases either. Now that said, these pairs are tradable. I'm just simply saying that when it comes to biases on these pairs, you should really be careful and always confirm the lower time frames before deciding your bias, whether long or short. Okay, so let me just sum this up for you. Let's go back to the weekly chart. Okay, so again on this weekly chart, that weekly short trade that form was right here. And so at this point, I'll be waiting for another weekly long trade to form so I could gauge the strength of this long trade against this last weekly short trade and then decide the short-term bias. So if this weekly short trade is stronger than this hypothetical long trade, then I'll be short bias, or in other words, price is likely to reach this pivot low right here before reaching this pivot high. And ideally wait for a pullback as much as possible so I could take a short entry, or perhaps take a short entry with the lower time frames, for example, the daily chart. Okay. All right, so that's it for the weekly forecast. I hope you guys have a great week, and thanks for watching. Okay, bye.